Okay, we are going to go through the first example in your homework as our notes today. So you are going to be given one representation and you're going to create the others. So we're looking at the math club members who want to buy shirts to wear during their math contests. They get prices from 3 different shirt companies and they learn that the prices may include a printing setup fee in addition to the cost of each shirt. Each shirt company represents its prices in a different way. Okay, and that makes sense. Most companies don't charge exactly the same thing as their competitors. Okay, so we're going to start by using those slope words and those y-intercept words to identify what the slope and y-intercept mean in this problem. Okay, so if I'm looking at a printing setup fee, the printing setup fee is something that's going to happen one time. It's an initial fee. It's a setup fee. It's going to just happen one time. They're only going to set up once for printing your order. Okay, so that's going to act as our y-intercept. Okay, and then if we look at the cost of each shirt, each is one of those slope words. So the slope is going to represent the cost of each shirt. Okay, and that's going to be important as we work with the verbal description. So I'm going to bubble this in so that we don't forget that it's up there because we're going to need to go back and look at it. Okay. All right, so for the first example, you have your table and you need to create the graph, the rule, and the description. Okay, so when we're graphing, we need to make sure that we label our axes, scale our axes, and then plot our points. Okay, so our X column in our table is the number of shirts. So that's going to be our label for the x-axis. And then the Y column is the price, so that's going to be our y-axis label. Okay, so I have to get from 0 to 15 on my x-axis. So I think I'm going to end up counting by 2s, but I'm only going to label the 10s. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. 2, 4, 6, 8, 20. Okay. And then on my y-axis, I need to get from 0 all the way up to 300. So I think I'm going to count by 50s. And I'm going to just label the 100s. So every other one is 100. And that's going to get me all the way up to 400. Okay. Last thing I need to do is plot these points. So I have one shirt, costs $20. So one shirt would fall exactly halfway between 0 and 2. And 20 would be almost halfway between 0 and 50. 5 shirts would be between 4 and 6, and 100 is right on a grid line. 10 shirts is on a grid line, so is $200. 15 would be exactly halfway between 14 and 16, and 300 is on a grid line. And you want to make sure that your graph is showing a line. This is a linear function, so it should look like a line. And you can connect those if you want, but you do not have to. Okay. Next thing we're going to do is write our rule. When we're writing our rule, it is always a good idea to start with the skeleton, keeping in mind that the first box is our slope, and we find our slope by finding the change in y over the change in x. The second box is our y-intercept, and we find that when x is equal to 0. Okay, so I'm going to go back over to my table, and I'm going to find my change in y and my change in x. So from 20 to 100, I'm adding 80. From 100 to 200, I'm adding 100. 2 to 3, I'm adding 100. Now I'm going to go on my x column, and I'm looking at 1 to 5. 1 to 5 is adding 4. 5 to 10 is adding 5. 10 to 15 is adding 5. Okay, now you'll notice that those are not the same numbers. all the way down, but that's okay because when I take a change in y and its corresponding change in x, they will give me the same slope when the relationship is linear. So if I look at my change in y over my change in x, if I take 80 divided by 4, that gives me 20, which would be the same thing if I took 100 divided by 5. They would all give me a slope of 20. So I'm going to fill that into my rule. Okay. And then, when we make our own tables, we like to start them with 0 so that we don't have to work backwards to find the y-intercept. But in this case, we don't have 0 in our table. Okay, so from 1, we have to go back to 0 by subtracting 1. So that means our change in x is 1, which means our change in y is 20. Because if you think about our slope being 20, it's $20 per one shirt, which means my change in y is 20 and my change in x is 1. So if I start counting by ones in my table, I'm going to be counting by 20s on my y column. So if I subtract 20, that gives me a y-intercept of 0. And my rule is done. The only thing I have left to do is I have to write my verbal description, and that's where this rainbow bubble above comes in. I know my slope is 20. I know my y-intercept is 0, so I'm just going to write a verbal description. So the cost of each shirt is $20 because my slope is $20. And since my y-intercept is 0, there is no printing setup fee. And we're done.